So let's begin with our motivation. And I think especially now, after yet another school shooting and 17 people dead, we have to really renew our bodhicitta again and again and again. Make sure we don't abandon it by getting angry, falling into despair, wanting to retaliate. But whenever we face adversity, to really hang on to what is virtuous and not let our mind go into old habits of negativity. So let's cultivate compassion, not only for the kids and the adults that were slaughtered in the middle of a school day, but also for the kid who was so confused that he thought doing that would alleviate his suffering. And also for the lawmakers who in one way or another fudge their way out of making laws that will protect the citizens of this country. And for people in the NRA and beyond who feel that their right to own weapons is more important than people's right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So compassion isn't sufficient. We have to act and do what we can as citizens of this country to make our voice heard for reasonable gun control laws. And for doing something to help young men who seem to be the ones who perpetrate a lot of these things. And then, of course, in our own lives, to act with kindness and in a non-harmful way to everyone that we encounter. And so with that kind of motivation, and let's listen to the teachings so that we can learn how to think clearly. And with the ability to think clearly, may we never generate these kinds of wrong views that justify, rationalize, and perpetrate harm against other living beings. So I started off talking about that because normally I would have spoken at it at lunchtime with the BBC because I know a lot of people are hurting from it. But I didn't do that today, so I thought I'd speak a little bit about it now, and maybe you can extract this part and put it, the meditation, and then now, and put it on the BBC. Yeah. I forget the statistics, but there's been a large number of school shootings just since the new year, and 3 of the 10 most deadly school shootings have happened in the last 5 months.
19.
Pardon?
19 this year.
19 this year. And we're only 6 weeks into the year. And there's been 19 school shootings. Yeah, so something is definitely quite wrong. And, you know, some people say it's this, some people say it's that. It's probably a lot of those things. but we have to work on all the fronts. Yeah. And I think gun control laws is a very good front to start with. Yeah. Trump said he attributed it to mental illness, but then the advocates for the mentally ill said that is being biased against those people because not everybody who is mentally ill is violent and dangerous. Now, we shouldn't spread that kind of thought in society. Yeah. But there's something going on. And like I said, I wonder, it's a lot of young people have a lot of anger over something or another and are expressing it in this kind of way. And like I said, it seems to be particularly young men. And so what is it that they are needing? What can we do to help? And how can we limit the availability of weapons? I frankly don't understand why it's so important to have assault weapons on the market. Yeah. But of course, I disagree with a lot of the whole thing. How people read the Second Amendment, I disagree with. I actually would like if we repealed the Second Amendment, to tell you the truth. Because I've lived in countries like Singapore where there are no weapons. Yeah, and it's fantastic. As a woman, you can walk around Singapore 10, 11 at night. Nobody's going to bother you. Yeah. But we have a particular culture here. It's something with the American culture, I think we need some discussion about that, how violence has played a big role in our history and our culture and what we think is acceptable. Yeah. Starting with the Tea Party, going to the Revolution, and then somebody counted up that, all the years that this country's been involved in one war or another war is incredible. Way over half of our history. I mean, if I look just since when I was born, how many years we've been involved in one war or another war. Yeah? Something's wrong. So, it's very easy to get discouraged and throw up our hands and say the world's going to hell in a handbasket. But having refuge in the Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha doesn't give us the possibility of falling into despair. Yeah. If you have any refuge at all, it's impossible to fall into despair. And you know that if you fall into despair, you're really betraying your own refuge. Yeah. So it's important for us to always keep an optimistic mind and really deepen our refuge in the three jewels again and again and again. And, particularly to make sure that we never do something like that. Now, we might say, well, that's outrageous. I would never even do that. But when you think, beginningless lives, how many times have we done that? Because they say, we've done everything. Yeah? So, until we reach the path of seeing and start actually eliminating the afflictions from their root, we can't say authoritatively that in this life or any of our future lives that we will be immune from this kind of behavior. Of course, we can set deep imprints, like taking precepts and restoring our precepts, like we did today. We all did today. Read our precepts, restored our precepts, And so doing that again and again puts that imprint into our mind, which is good and acts as a barrier to that behavior. But we can't just, be complacent and say, oh, my afflictions will never get the best of me. Okay. So the thing is, we have to we have to be leaders, at least in the attitude and the approach to things. We may not have tremendous power in Congress, but we have the power to keep through our talk, our teachings, to keep people's minds in a good place and to encourage civic responsibility and speaking up about these kinds of things. Okay? Then there's a few little things I wanted to talk about before getting into the teaching. So this was a card we received, because this is the Earth Dog year. Yeah? It begins tomorrow. Yeah, tomorrow is Losar and Chinese New Year. Yeah, the Tibetans and Chinese finally agree on something. Usually the dates aren't even the same. But this year, Beijing and Lhasa are in accord. So our friend Kenmo Droma from Vajradakini Nunnery sent this card. And it has a little story in it about Kukuripa, who his name is the dog lover. Okay. So Kukuripa, was a tantric master in ancient India. He adopted a starving dog who became a companion during his 12 years meditating in a cave. One day, the gods of the 33, that's one of the god realms, the 33 sensual heavens, took note of Kukuripa's accomplishments and invited him to their heavens, where he was given great feasts. Yum. Feasts, honor, by the gods, no less. Eventually, he looked down from the heavens and saw that his dog had become thin, sad, and hungry. And he was struck with remorse, and he returned to the cave. Both master and dog were happy, and upon scratching her, the dog instantly vanished. In her place stood a Dakini. The Dakini chided him for allowing sensuality and attachment to honor and so forth to cause forgetfulness of his loving companion. And then, because he remembered her, she helped him to gain realizations. He then lived a long life for the benefit of others. So the motto of the story, there's a few mottos. You never know who is a highly realized practitioner. And, don't take your companions for granted. But treasure them, like in a monastic community, treasuring your fellow monastics. And don't get distracted by attachment to sense pleasure and honor. But stay firm in the Dharma. It says, Mr. Bow Wow. Okay. Then another thing I wanted to share with you that I was thinking about is when we have a teaching like this, the 6 harmonies that the Sangha shares are evident. Yeah. And, of course, we talked about the 6 harmonies during the Vinaya course. But if you look, just this very moment, sitting here, harmony in the body, we're all sitting in appropriate physical behavior to listen to a teaching. Harmony in speech, we recited prayers together, and hopefully we will have a discussion that is respectful of each other in our speech. Harmony in mind, we all generated the bodhicitta motivation, at the very beginning of the teachings. And that's really important, and I think that's what really brings a community together, is the harmony and the motivation. Yeah? Because if we don't have the same motivation and we're looking for our own pleasure, or, I'll learn something and then I can teach it and get famous or whatever, then that really disturbs the harmony in the community. Harmony in views, we're all wanting to learn how to do debate and how to learn how to be reasonable, with real reasoning. Harmony in precepts, we are keeping our precepts here together, especially the essence of the precepts, which is non-harmfulness. And harmony in resources, we're sharing the resources equally. Nobody's sitting on some extravagant seat that's better than everybody else. And nobody's wearing fine, glamorous clothes. And we're all equal in keeping the 8 Mahayana precepts today. Okay? So just to share that, here's a kind of example, just right in one moment, how the 6 harmonies are at play in our lives. Okay, now let's do the teaching. So I want to read a little bit, and then both our friends Leah and Julie sent some syllogisms, and Venerable Sultan also sent some syllogisms. And so we'll take a look at those and, see how we're picking up what syllogism's about. But first, let's read a little bit. So last time we were talking about the similar and dissimilar classes. So when you have a reason, the similar class is everything that is, in the one that the person is impermanent because it's a product, then the similar class would be everything that's impermanent. So everything that is in accord with the predicate. And then the dissimilar class is everything that is contradictory to the predicate. So everything that's permanent or everything that is non-impermanent phenomena. Okay? So if a sign is the counter-pervasion, or if the reason, is the counter-pervasion in the proof of something, it is ascertained as universally absent in the dissimilar class. Okay, so remember when we're looking at the 3 criteria to see if the property applies to the subject, to check the pervasion, so that if it's the reason, it necessarily must be the predicate, and then to check the counter-pervasion. If it's not the predicate, then it's necessarily not the reason. Okay? For the sample syllogism, this means that product is ascertained as universally absent among non-impermanent phenomena. Okay, this is established for products exist exclusively amongst impermanent phenomena. Thus, you cannot find any products in a class that is mutually exclusive with the similar class. Okay, so you can't find anything in the dissimilar class. That's what he's saying. There are no products that are non-impermanent phenomena. Okay? In the definition of counter-pervasion, as in the definition of the other two modes of the sign, there is an epistemological requirement of how and by whom a sign must be ascertained, and an ontological requirement of how the reason, I should be saying reason instead of sign, of how the reason must exist in relation to its basis of relation. The reason must be ascertained as the counter-pervasion by a person who is actively involved in the reasoning process. Okay? So this is, how to ascertain that it's a valid syllogism. It's not a valid syllogism just because the words are out there and it's formed correctly and it makes sense. It has to make sense to a particular person. Yeah, somebody who's sleeping cannot be that person. Yeah, somebody who doesn't care beans about whether the person is permanent or impermanent is not that person. Okay, somebody who has very strong belief in a permanent soul, they're not that person either. Okay, so it has to be somebody that is interested and capable of understanding. Yeah. So in this case, the ontological requirement is that the sign must be universally absent in the dissimilar class. And although, according to the requirements of the forward pervasion, it must exist exclusively in the similar class, it may or may not be universally present in the similar class. Wait a minute. The ontological requirement is that the reason must be universally absent in the dissimilar class. And although it must exist exclusively in the similar class, it may or may not be universally present in the similar class. Yeah, because if you have one that's a big circle and the reason's a small circle, it may not be universally present in the similar class. This is to say that the extent of the reason may be less than the extent of the predicate to be proven. Okay, everybody get that? As in the cases of the property of the subject and the forward pervasion, only the reason is the counter-pervasion. Okay, so when we talk about the three criteria, it's all attributes of the reason. Still, the counter-pervasion is formulated between the reason and its basis of relation, which is the dissimilar class. In general, this is, whatever is not that predicate to be proven is necessarily not that reason. Okay? So applied to the same syllogism, the counter-pervasion is formulated. Whatever is not an impermanent phenomenon is necessarily not a product. Okay? Since all products are impermanent phenomena, anything that is not an impermanent phenomena cannot be a product. Note that this is the contrapositive. I think that's a philosophical term in Western philosophy. Properly done by reversing the antecedent, something as a product, and the consequent, it is an impermanent phenomena, and negating both. So there I think he's trying to talk to Western philosophers to point out how it works with them. The nature of counter-pervasion is reflective of and results from the nature of the forward pervasion. For any syllogism in which the reason is established as the forward pervasion, that reason will also be the counter-pervasion. Yeah? So if you draw it out, the two ways that the forward pervasion can be, either where if it's, in the example, if it's a product, what's our syllogism?
Self is impermanent because it is a product of causes.
Okay, so the self is impermanent because it's a product of causes. Okay, so if product, the reason, and impermanent, the predicate, they are equivalent terms, so the two circles have exactly the same size, okay? So that works. Yeah, and then anything that's not in those two, that's going to be the dissimilar. Then in another one, my tree is a mammal because of being a cat. Yeah, then being a mammal is your big circle if you draw it, and being a cat is a small circle inside of it. Yeah. So then anything that's a cat is necessarily a mammal, but it's not that anything is a mammal is necessarily a cat. But anything that is not a mammal is necessarily not a cat. Okay? Still, the values of these two types of pervasion are somewhat different, the forward and counter pervasions. The main requirement of the forward pervasion is that the reason must exist exclusively in the similar class. Okay? Whereas the main requirement of the counter pervasion is that the reason must be universally absent in the dissimilar class. So they come to the same point if you draw your circles, but the way you're getting to that point is different, okay? Also, the ascertainment of the forward pervasion and the ascertainment of the counter pervasion are different sorts of realizations. So this is interesting. If a person explicitly realizes the forward pervasion, okay, so they know that if it's a product, it must be impermanent. That person would also implicitly realize the counter pervasion, that if it's not impermanent, it's definitely not a product. But they realize that implicitly. And if a person explicitly realizes the counter pervasion, that if it's not impermanent, it's not going to be a product, that person would implicitly realize the forward pervasion, that if it's a product, it's necessarily impermanent. Okay? So although they are ontologically concomitant, so those two things come to the same point, for if the reason is one, then it must also be the other as well. They are explicitly ascertained separately. Okay? So they come to the same point, but the way you understand them is a little bit different. Okay? Then there's a whole section here of the components of a syllogism all together in one place. So let's review this, and then we'll get on to our sample syllogisms from the class participants. Okay, so let's have our sample syllogism. The subject sound is an impermanent phenomena. Let's do the subject, the self, is an impermanent phenomena because of being a product. Okay. So I'm going to ask you some questions. What's the subject? Self. Okay. What's the predicate to be proven?
It's impermanent.
Okay. impermanent, yeah, or impermanent phenomena. What's the reason? Product. Good. What is that which is to be proven? Self is what? Impermanent. Okay, that's also called the thesis. Yeah. And formulated in general, that subject is the predicate to be proven. Oh, okay. Then, what's the predicate to be negated? Okay, not impermanent is what you're negating. Yeah, by establishing permanent, you're negating the dissimilar class, not impermanent. Okay? And so that's also that which is to be negated, so that the self is a permanent phenomena. Okay, what's the similar class? Impermanent phenomena. The dissimilar class? Okay, you can say either permanent phenomena or non-impermanent phenomena. What's the difference between those two?
Non-impermanent phenomena would include non-existence.
Right. Non-impermanent phenomena includes non-existence. Yeah. Then, what's the property of the subject? Self is a product. Okay, that's the first of the criterion. Okay, so to define it, that which is ascertained, and then in parentheses, for a person for whom it has become the property of the subject and the proof of the self as an impermanent phenomena by the sign product. Okay, so that which is ascertained as only existing in accordance with the mode of the statement, which means if it's an is statement or a exist statement, as only existing with sound. Okay, so that doesn't mean that the reason only applies to the subject, because there's certainly more things than the self or than sound that are a product. Okay, but the only means that the self only falls in the category of being a product. It doesn't fall in the category of being a non-product. Okay. Then, what's the forward pervasion? You have to say the whole sentence loudly so I can hear you.
Whatever is impermanent is necessarily a product.
Okay, whatever is impermanent is necessary. No. Whatever is a product, necessarily impermanent. Or another way to say it is, if it's a product, it's necessarily impermanent. Okay, that's the forward pervasion. What is the counter pervasion? Wait, everybody's talking at once. Try one person. If it's
not impermanent, it cannot be a product of causes.
Yeah, so if it's not impermanent, then it's not a product. That's the counter pervasion. Okay. So formulated in general, whatever is not that predicate to be proven is necessarily not that sign. Okay. Then there's an epistemological requirement. Yeah. So the fourth and final main characteristic required for a valid Buddhist syllogism concerns the set of epistemological requirements. For each of the three modes, there is an epistemological requirement. In relation to the property of the subject, the reason is correct only for a person who has ascertained definitely that the self is a product. Okay, so if the person is not convinced that the self is a product, that whole syllogism is not going to be valid, because a syllogism is valid in relationship to a specific person. It's not like it's valid in thin air. Okay, that's what this epistemological requirement is getting at. Okay, so that person has to definitely know that the self is a product. Yeah, if they doubt, if they're not sure, self is a product. Well, I don't know, because I was taught that there's a soul that is just there, that wasn't produced or wasn't created. It's just there. That's the essence of me and always has been. Okay? So somebody who thinks like that, they're not going to fulfill that epistemological requirement. Okay? So this is where you see that sometimes when you're trying to prove something to somebody, that person needs a certain amount of background to understand what you're saying to them. And so you may need to do all sorts of other syllogisms first to get that person prepared to understand what you're trying to say. So in relation to the forward pervasion, the sign is correct only for a person who realizes definitely that the reason exists exclusively among members of a similar class. Okay, so it's only going to be valid, and that sign, the reason, is only going to be suitable if that person realizes that if it's a product, it must be impermanent. Mm-hmm. Yeah. If the person isn't sure, well, can't you have something that's produced, but there's a part of it that's also permanent? Yeah? Like, I was produced, but there's a permanent self somewhere inside my aggregates. So I'm not fully convinced that if it's a product, it must be impermanent. Okay? So that kind of person also, it's not going to work for that person. And in relation to the counter-pervasion, the sign is correct, the reason is correct only for a person who realizes definitely that the reason is universally absent from the dissimilar class. So somebody realizes that, being a product is totally absent from everything that is not impermanent. Okay? Moreover, remember that the three criteria of a correct sign are set in sequence. This is why they are called first criteria, second criteria, and third criteria. When these have been understood in sequence, a fully qualified opponent, which may be ourself, actually, if we're trying to think things through clearly, a fully qualified opponent is then ready to acquire the new understanding that is the conclusion of the syllogism. This is why in a valid syllogism, there cannot be the same thing in part 2, the predicate of the probandum, and part 3, the reason, since once a person, or an opponent, has understood the property of the subject, that person would have already understood the conclusion, thus breaking the sequence. I think it's not that you're just breaking the sequence by doing that, but you're making a ridiculous argument. The color of the cup is blue because it's blue. Okay? I am right because I'm me. That's something that we say a lot. Yeah? I'm more important because I'm me. Yeah? So that's a ridiculous syllogism. Yeah? Well, no, because I am more important because I'm me. That one you can analyze, okay? But I am more important because I am more important. That's not going to work, okay? How about, let's analyze that one. I am more important because I'm me. Okay, what's the subject? Predicate? More important. Reason? Because I'm me. Okay. What's the property? I am me. Does that hold? Yeah, that holds. Then what's the pervasion?
There's no pervasion.
Yeah. If it's me, it's more important. Is that true? You bet.
What are you talking about?
Okay. Now, this is the way we think, but is it true that if it's me, it's more important? No. Okay, what's the counter pervasion? If it's not important, it's not me. We think that's true too, don't we? Yeah, it doesn't concern me. If it's something unimportant, then it clearly has nothing to do with me.
We tend to think if it's not me, it's not important.
Yeah, we go that way too. Yeah. Okay. Okay, let's see. Where were we? One thing that we may understand from the criteria for validity is that the premises must be verifiably true, certified as concordant with fact by ascertaining valid cognizers, which are incontrovertible consciousnesses that correctly know their objects. So, is there a reliable cognizer that knows that if it's me, it's more important?
Me?
Yes, my reliable cognizer knows. Well, unfortunately, there's more criteria than just being my cognizer to establish something as a reliable cognizer. Okay, so that's not going to hold water. Okay. Someone may make the argument the subject, the self, is a permanent phenomena because of being a product. And the argument may sound true in the sense that if the premises were true, then the conclusion would be true because it's kind of set up. It sounds good, The self is a permanent phenomena because of being a product. That's how you set up a syllogism. However, it is not factually true according to the assertions of this system of philosophy. Thus, it is not valid. Here, product is a contradictory reason, for products do not exist exclusively in the similar class of permanent phenomena. So you're trying to prove that the self is permanent because it's a product, but products do not exist exclusively in impermanent phenomena. In permanent phenomena. In fact, it's just the opposite. They are universally absent in what would be the similar class in that incorrect syllogism. Emphasizing the imperative in Buddhist reasoning that pervasion must be associative in the real world in the way that productness is always associated with impermanent phenomena. In the commentary on the Wheel of Reasons, Dendar Larampa explains that the association of pervasion between the reason and the predicate is to be proven, is objectively established, and is not established by one's mere wish. Darn. Because if it were, then, if it's me, it must be important. Okay? If pervasion were established through one's mere wish, then even contradictory signs would become correct provers. So that would mean that if it was just our wish that something true, then because it's me, would be a correct sign for me being more important. Yeah. The correct pervasion of the reason by the predicate is to be proven is a necessary association of these two phenomena. It is objectively established from the side of the objects. Okay, it is not built up out of one's subjective interpretation or imagination. So we may believe that if it's me, it must be more important. But is that an objective fact that is well known in the world? Okay? So just what this is getting at is just because I believe something doesn't mean it's true. Doesn't mean it's a correct reason. Just because I believe it, just because I was taught that when I was a kid and I trusted whoever taught me that, or just because everybody around me thinks that way, and if I didn't think that way, people would think I was crazy. None of that acts as a valid reason for saying that it's true because I believe it. Okay? So here's another syllogism. Yeah? Any thought I think is true because it's a thought I think. Because it's my thought. Okay? So what's the subject?
Anything I think.
Yeah. Anything I think. What's the predicate?
It's true.
Is true. What's the reason? Because it's my thought, or because I thought it. What's the property of the subject?
Anything I think I thought.
Yeah, anything I think is a thought I thought. Okay, that's okay. What's the pervasion?
It's necessarily true.
If it's something that I think, it must be true.
Necessarily.
Not necessarily, 100%, irrefutably, incontrovertibly, it must be true if I thought it. Yeah? True or false?
True.
Okay? So now you see why don't believe everything you think. Yeah, the title of that book makes a lot of sense. Yeah. Okay. Pervasion is a necessary association of two related phenomena and predicated from the natures of those phenomena. So those the reason and the predicate, must have this close relationship that depends on their nature. Yeah, one being the other. Okay. Furthermore, even arguments that are formally sound and factually true may or may not be valid, for a valid argument must meet the epistemological requirements concerning the person faced with the argument. The person must be one who is actively seeking to understand the thesis or the conclusion of the syllogism. So we all know that when we're in a quarrel with somebody, in a disagreement with somebody, we are not at all interested in hearing their reasons and how they think. Our mind is totally closed. Similarly, the other person is not at all interested in our reasons, our syllogisms. Yeah. And this is due to the power of stubbornness, the power of anger, the power of attachment to our own views, the power of ignorance. And we can see it so clearly, when there's an argument with somebody and nobody is listening to the other person, and they don't want to listen to the other person. Okay? So even though that other person may give a correct syllogism, it's not going to be a correct syllogism for us because we understand it. It's not going to be a correct syllogism for the person they're arguing with because they aren't interested in it. Okay? So this is a problem in human communication, isn't it? Yeah. When our mind shuts down, it shuts down. Yeah. This is like the government shut down, you know. It only lasted a few hours last week, you know. But our mind, when it shuts down, long time. Furthermore, even arguments, okay, we already said that. The person must be one who is actively seeking to understand the thesis or the conclusion of the syllogism. An argument is not valid for all persons at all times. Okay? For one who has already ascertained the conclusion, is it going to be a valid argument, a valid syllogism, if that person has already realized it? No. Okay, because they already know it. Okay. For somebody who's unable to ascertain the conclusion, is it going to be valid for them? No, it's not going to work for them either. Okay. Thus, in this system of reasoning, even an argument that is logically sound in the sense that a true conclusion flows from the true premises, it's not necessarily valid. A valid argument must be sound. Yeah, a valid argument must be sound. So if it's a valid argument, it must be sound. But if it's a sound argument, it's not necessarily valid. For example, what's an example of an argument that is sound but is not necessarily valid?
Self is impermanent because it's a product. Really?
No, you can't say that. Because remember, valid is in relationship to a person. You just threw that out.
But really, I mean, the way I think about it is, this makes sense to me, but if I haven't actually realized that the self is a product, so is it really a valid solution?
So then you have to say, you know, because here we're examining if it's a sound argument, it's is it necessarily valid?
Right.
And we say no. And I ask for an example of a sound argument that isn't necessarily valid. And you just threw out, you know, the self is impermanent because it's a product. But I'm somebody who's interested to know something about the self. And I just heard that, and wow, it really clarified things for me. So for me, it's a valid syllogism.
But for me, well, my point is, for me, it's probably not.
Okay, but you didn't say that. You can't just say, I asked for an example of a sound argument that's not necessarily valid. And you have to say, if the self is impermanent because it's a product for somebody like me.
I see.
That would be a correct example. But just saying that argument is invalid for, you know, in general, this is not correct.
But there's no such thing as an in general, is what it sounds like, is there's no such thing as whether an argument is valid or invalid in general. Yes.
Yeah, that's why you have to specify for who it's invalid. If I say, give me an example of an argument that's invalid.
Sound but invalid.
An argument that's invalid. You have to give the example of an argument that's in relationship to a particular person.
So can you say again how that would work?
Okay, you would have to say an example of an argument that is a sound argument that is not necessarily valid would be the self is impermanent because it's a product of causes for me. Because I don't understand that the self is a product of causes. But you can't give the example, an example of a sound argument that's not necessarily valid. You can't just say, the self is impermanent because it's a product of causes, because that argument is valid for His Holiness.
He probably already realizes it, so it's not valid for him either.
Yeah, it's not valid for him. Okay, that's true. But, for somebody like me who just goes, oh, okay, I get it now, then it's not going to be a sound argument that's not valid. It's going to be a sound argument that is valid. But for you, if you don't realize it, then it's going to be a sound argument that's not valid.
Could you say it's about epistemology rather than ontology? In other words, it's investigating how one knows rather than what things are. It's tracing how one comes to
It's both things, because we are looking at what something is, but then also looking at the epistemological thing of who understands that. Okay, because his whole point here is something is only a valid argument or invalid argument, if it's factually concordant, and if it applies to a person who is interested in understanding that particular thing and can understand the three criteria. Okay? So there's some things that have to be present for it to be a valid argument. Are people understanding this? Yeah? It's, for example, okay, I can't say cantaloupe is a rotten food. Okay? Or cantaloupe will make you sick. Okay? If I say cantaloupe will make you sick, for one person, that statement is true. For another person, that statement is not true. Okay? So it being true or not true depends on who we're speaking of. So it's the same thing here. An argument is valid or invalid in terms of who it's addressed to.
When we say valid, do we mean valid cognizer or current cognizer, or is it different?
Well, the things that valid just here means correct, but the thing is that all three criteria have to be ascertained by three valid cognizers. Yeah. So related. Anyway, go home and think about it.
I guess my question is, what level of realization, what's the level of realization that's required?
Okay. It means you have to really get it.
Right.
Okay?
Yeah. Is it a realization or is it something you just can
No,
ponder?
you have to definitely know it. You have to know it by a valid cognizer, not by a correct assumption. Okay? So there's a difference. Correct assumption, oh yeah, that sounds right, that sounds good.
Right.
Valid cognizer is, oh, I got it.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, now, so Leah and Julie sent two things. They sent one version of their syllogism, and then they sent the next week another version of it. Okay, so let's start with one here. Okay. Okay. So here it is. On winter days in Seattle, Julie cannot experience happiness because the days are cold and dark. What's the subject? On winter days in Seattle, Julie cannot experience happiness because the days are cold and dark.
I think the first part's Julie is the subject.
Who are we talking about? Julie. Okay, what's the predicate? Cannot experience happiness. What's the reason? Because the days are cold or dark. What's this thing in front on winter days in Seattle? It's a modifier, but what's it doing in front? And what does it pertain to Julie? Does it pertain to experience happiness? Does it pertain to the days being cold and dark? Yeah, so the syllogism isn't written properly. Yeah, it has this extra clause that's kind of floating around. She said when she wrote it that the subject was on winter days in Seattle. And she said the predicate was Julie cannot experience happiness. That's not the predicate. Okay. So how would you rewrite this? Let me give you the next one. Okay. So that one, something's wrong with it. Okay. So here's the new one that they said. Julie is unhappy on winter days in Seattle. That's better. Because the days are cold and dark. Subject. Predicate. Unhappy on winter days in Seattle. Okay. Reason? Because the days are cold and dark. Now, what's the property of the subject?
Julie is unhappy because the days are cold and dark. Julie is cold and dark.
Yeah. Is the criteria of the property with the property of the reason being the property of the subject? Yeah, the property's not established because the days are cold and dark has nothing to do with Julie. Okay. So how would you write this so that it would make some sense?
Winter days make Julie unhappy because they're cold and dark. Very good.
Winter days make Julie unhappy because they're cold and dark. Okay. Subject. Winter days. Predicate. Make Julie unhappy. Reason. Because they're cold and dark. What's the property?
Winter days are cold and dark.
Winter days are cold and dark. Is that true?
In Seattle. Not completely.
It's not true, is it? Not all winter days are cold and dark.
Not even in Seattle.
Not even in Seattle. Yeah, there's one or two that aren't. Okay, so the property of the subject doesn't hold, because not all winter days are cold and dark. What's the pervasion? Yeah.
If winter days are cold and dark, Julie is necessarily unhappy.
Yeah, if winter days are cold and dark, Julie is necessarily unhappy. Is that true? No. So it's interesting because, they commented at the bottom here that these are the kinds of things we say to ourselves that we believe. But if we try and put them into a syllogistic form, we can't come up with something that makes sense. Yeah, because this one you would have to qualify so much. Yeah, because, Julie is unhappy on winter days that are cold and dark, but she's not always unhappy on winter days that are cold and dark. And Julie is, what was it? Winter days in Seattle often make Julie unhappy. But do the winter days make her unhappy? No. There's no cause and effect relationship. They don't do something to her.
You
Okay.
start saying often, aren't you getting away from a real syllogism?
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah. Otherwise, it's often, that doesn't really prove much, does it? Okay.
Good effort, though.
Yeah. Okay, so here's the second one. Here's the first version of it. Email communication is subject to communication etiquette that requires a timely reply because email is an accepted form of communication.
No.
Okay, now let me read it again and tell me what the subject is. Email communication is subject to communication etiquette that requires a timely reply because email is an accepted form of communication. What's the subject? Email communication. What's the predicate?
Is subject to communication.
Is subject to communication etiquette that requires a timely reply. What's the reason? Because email is an accepted form of communication. Okay, so what is the property? Email communication is an accepted form of communication. Is that true or not true?
Yes.
Yeah.
For most people.
That's true for most people.
What happens if you're in the middle of the outback?
Yeah,
But there's
You
some
have
people,
everything, it doesn't know a computer.
yeah. We would probably have to say for most people, it's an accepted form of communication.
there are people that don't have computers on purpose.
Yes,
They don't accept it.
yeah. Okay. So the property doesn't hold. What's the forward pervasion?
Accepted form of communication.
Yeah. Yeah. If it's an accepted form of communication, it is subject to communication etiquette that requires a timely reply. Is that true? Yeah. If it's an accepted form of communication, is it necessarily subject to communication etiquette that requires a timely reply? No. What's an example of something that doesn't apply to? Spam would be a very good example, okay? It's an accepted form of communication for some people, or just advertisement. Yeah, it's an accepted form of communication, but is it subject to communication etiquette that requires a timely reply? No.
I get emails that say, do not reply to this.
Yeah.
They're just notices.
Yeah. Okay. Then, then they rewrote it. Okay. Email communication is one form of communication for which there is no established etiquette. Oh, wait a minute. No, sorry. I read that there's that one too. But that one. Well, yeah, we just hit that one, so let's do it. What's the subject?
Is there a reason? We didn't have a because.
Yeah. Email communication is one, because she called this a syllogism. Email communication is one form of communication for which there is no established etiquette.
Yeah.
Is that a syllogism?
No.
Why not?
Right, because for a reason is the same thing.
Yeah. Well, there's no reason in this thing. This is just a statement.
Yeah.
It's not a syllogism. You need a because. You need a reason.
Let's look at the 3
Email
points.
communication is one form of communication for which there is no established etiquette.
You could say because in place of for which there is.
But that's different. This, what's literally written here, is a statement, not a syllogism. If you want to make it into a syllogism, email communication is one form of communication because there is no established etiquette. That doesn't hold water.
Or you could add something on the end that says it's because some people reply and some don't.
Yeah. If you wanted to prove email communication is one form of communication,
Well, you'd have to prove.
what reason would you give?
No one has doubt about it. Because people communicate with it.
Because people communicate with it. That would have to be your reason if you want to prove that statement. Okay, here's the other one. Email communication is subject to communication etiquette that requires a timely reply because email is an accepted form of communication. Oh, that's the same one we looked at before. Yeah, okay. Okay. Then, okay. Okay, so here they gave, so to typically prove the Lamrim topic, mind is the source of happiness and unhappiness, here's the thing that they give. When I engage in harsh speech, I know there is self-centered thought because I know I am unhappy. When I engage in harsh speech, I know there is self-centered thought because I know I am unhappy, or because I am unhappy. Or another way they wrote it, when I engage in harsh speech, there is self-centered thought because I am unhappy.
It's the same with the first one. When I engage in harsh speech is a modifier.
Yeah, when I engage in harsh speech is not a proper subject. You would have to say, what would you have to say?
My harsh speech.
My harsh speech. Okay. But when I engage in harsh speech is not a proper subject. Okay.
My harsh speech involves self-centered thought.
Involves self-centered. Yeah.
My harsh speech involves a self-centered thought.
Because I am.
What are we proving?
We're trying to say, we've got to say it. It involves means what? Yeah. Well, let's try it anyway. My harsh speech involves self-centered thought because I am unhappy. Subject? My harsh speech. Predicate? Involves self-centered thought. Yeah. Reason? Because I'm unhappy.
So the thesis is my harsh
Speech
Makes me
involves self-centered thought because I am unhappy. Okay, what's the property of the subject?
harsh speech makes me unhappy.
Harsh speech, my harsh speech, and I am unhappy.
Harsh speech can't be unhappy.
Yeah. Harsh speech isn't unhappy, is it?
Speech itself.
Okay.
You read him as my harsh speech is a source of unhappiness. No, my harsh speech. My harsh speech is a source of unhappiness because it's driven by the self-centered thought.
Okay. Let's try that. My harsh speech, what?
Is a source of unhappiness.
Is a source of unhappiness
Because it's driven by
the self-centered thought. So that's a completely different syllogism. Because now unhappiness is in the predicate and self-centered thought is in the reason. So this may make more sense. Yeah. So subject, my harsh speech, predicate,
Makes me unhappy.
it makes me unhappy. Reason, because it's driven by self-centered thought. What's the property?
My self-centered
Our speech is driven by self-centered thought. That sounds reasonable. Okay. Then the pervasion. If it's driven by self-centered thought, it necessarily makes me unhappy. Is that true?
Necessarily short term.
Not in the short term. Not in the short term. That's why our self-centered thought is so, is so effective, because in the short term, it can bring us happiness. So you would have to specify, my harsh speech is a source of unhappiness in the long term because it's driven by self-centered thought. Yeah, that one would make sense, huh? So you have to qualify it, in the long term. You can't just, when you state things, it has to be very specific because it doesn't apply to everything. Okay, yeah?
So earlier today you said, when your mind's upset, there's afflictions. And there's got to be a syllogism there, and but you got to come up with a reason.
Okay, make the
I haven't been
syllogism.
able to figure it out. You're the one who said it.
I'm turning it back on you. What's the syllogism? What was the original statement? When my mind is unhappy, affliction is present. Okay.
So, an upset mind is an afflicted mind because
do you have something? Huh?
Because afflictions cause unhappiness.
So start from the beginning. What's the syllogism?
An upset mind is afflicted because afflictions cause being upset or unhappy.
There's nothing to prove there.
Yeah. An upset mind is afflicted because it's unhappy.
Because afflictions cause unhappiness.
No, then you're getting into then you have to prove first that afflictions cause unhappiness. Yeah, because somebody's going to say, what kind of reason is that? Because afflictions cause unhappiness. And so you have to prove that to them. Okay. But an upset mind is an afflicted mind because it's unhappy. Okay, let's try that. Subject? Upset mind. Predicate? Is afflicted. Is afflicted. Is an afflicted mind, yeah. Reason?
because it's unhappy.
Because it's an unhappy mind. Okay, or because it's unhappy. So what's the property? Mind is an unhappy mind. That's true. Wouldn't you say? Then what's the pervasion?
it's an unhappy, not necessarily.
If it's an unhappy mind, it's an afflictive mind. Yeah. Is that 100% true?
That's an affliction.
I know, but
Yeah.
it doesn't necessarily make you unhappy. In the short term. In the short term.
In the short term, yeah.
Yeah, but it doesn't have to be universally present.
Our thing is an upset mind. We're talking about an upset mind is afflicted because it's unhappy. So if it's unhappy, it's necessarily afflictive. Attachment doesn't come in there because we're talking about unhappy minds. So are there any cases of being unhappy when there's not an affliction? Yeah, regret. Yeah, regret would be an example of an unhappy mind. Regret, you have to specify, not just any regret, regret for a non-virtuous action. Okay? So regret for a non-virtuous action, is an unhappy mind, but it's not afflictive.
It depends on your definition of unhappy mind. Yeah, I would call that an unhappy mind.
Yeah, when you feel bad about saying something obnoxious to somebody, your mind's not unhappy.
If there's guilt involved.
If there's guilt involved, then it's unhappy.
Yeah.
But if it's just clear regret, then I'm not necessarily unhappy. I'm clear that I don't want to do that again. But the unhappiness I see is being afflicted, whether I'm beating myself up about it and stuff. So
okay.
That's where I'm coming from.
Okay,
Unhappiness.
so now we're coming into, for it to be a correct syllogism, everybody has to have the same definition of unhappy. Yeah.
At least the speaker and the listener.
Huh?
At least the speaker and the listener would have an agreement on.
Right, yeah. So everybody has to have the same agreement on what the words mean. This is actually one of the big problems between Bhavaviveka and Buddhapalita, is they had the same words, but Bhavaviveka thought they referred to truly existent objects, and Buddhapalita said, no, they refer to conventionally existent objects. And as a result, we have Laktung Chenmo that has this much explanation about it. Okay, let's go on. So that one is all maybe depending on how you define unhappy, it could be a true syllogism. Okay.
What about the subject, sentient beings suffer because they're ignorant?
People suffer.
Sentient beings suffer because they're ignorant.
People suffer because they're ignorant. Okay. Subject.
Sentient beings.
Yeah. Not just, okay, sentient beings. Then, what's the predicate? Suffer. What's the reason?
Because they're ignorant.
Because they're ignorant. Okay. What's the property? That true?
Yeah.
Not all sentient beings. Yeah, Aryas. An Arya in meditative equipoise is not ignorant.
Maybe ordinary beings.
Okay, then if you say ordinary beings, okay, ordinary beings are ignorant. All the time? What about an ordinary being who has an inference of emptiness? Yeah. Hmm? Are they ignorant or not ignorant?
You still see his inherent existence.
Huh?
The
doesn't still be inherent existence, so they're still ignorant.
Yeah, they still have the appearance of it. So you're defining ignorant meaning having the appearance of inherent existence. Somebody else could define ignorant as meaning having ignorance manifest in the mind.
Yeah, Arya beings have true existence appear to their minds. Arya bodhisattvas have true existence appear to their minds too.
Yeah. But we're talking about ordinary beings.
Yes, I know, but earlier we talked.
Yeah.
Not be ignorance. In order to not be ignorant, you have to have direct realization, the direct perception, versus inference is not direct perception.
Okay, so this is, we have to figure out what ignorance means. Does it mean, having the appearance of true existence? Does it mean ignorance manifesting in the mind? Does it mean having the seed of ignorance in the mind? What exactly does ignorant mean? Okay, and which form of ignorance are we talking about? The ignorance that misapprehends ultimate truth, or the ignorance of karma and its effects? Okay? So you see, when you're making a syllogism, you have to be very specific about things. Yeah? Because as soon as we start, talk, see, I had a friend who once said, it's amazing that we sentient beings ever communicate. And when you think about it, it is. Because here, we're just looking at what seems like initially a perfectly reasonable thing. Sentient beings suffer because they're ignorant. Yeah, of course. But when you really delve into it, what do these words really refer to? Yeah, because even when they talk about ignorance, sometimes they talk about it as, well, they talk about it in all those different ways, of having the seed of ignorance, of, having the appearance of true existence, of having manifest ignorance.
Would you say ordinary beings suffer because they have ignorance in their continuum? Is that specific enough?
Okay, try it out. Ordinary beings, it's in their continuum.
Yes.
That's true. If you have ignorance in your continuum, do you necessarily suffer? Yes. What does suffer mean?
How can that be even debatable?
If you say ordinary beings are subject to dukkha because they have ignorance in their continuum, that would be true. But just suffer? They don't always suffer because they have ignorance. We say, I'm happy, I ate some chocolate cake.
To say something's in your continuum, doesn't that mean anybody that's ever been ignorant? The Buddha was once ignorant.
No, it's some ignorance is in their continuum, not was in their continuum. For the Buddha, ignorance was.
But he's the continuum of a being that was once ignorant.
Yeah, but we're
so
talking
that's not
about
the same
ordinary.
continuum.
Or we're talking about ordinary beings is the subject.
What's in your continuum?
Okay, are subject to dukkha because they're ignorant. So we're talking about are ordinary beings ignorant? And then if you're ignorant, are you subject to, if you are ignorant, if you have ignorance in your continuum, that means at this present moment. It doesn't mean your previous continuum.
Well, then you go back to the thing of somebody might not have it in their mind at that moment if they have an inference.
Okay, maybe then you have to say, if ignorance has not been completely eliminated from your continuum. Or you could, they have, you can say ordinary beings do have ignorance in their continuum. That you can say. It may not be manifest, but it's in their continuum. Okay? So when you say something's in their continuum, it means now at the present moment. It doesn't mean the Buddha's past continuum, the previous beings who were Buddhas. Okay. Now here's one to take home with you because we have to end, but I'll give you the two that Venerable Samten said. And these ones you're going to have to think about, so write them down, okay? Okay, you ready? So here's the two. Students continue to die in school shootings because American gun laws don't adequately restrict access to guns. Students continue to die in school shootings because American gun laws don't adequately restrict access to guns. Okay? It sounds good. Take it home with you and play with it. See if it's true or not. Here's the second one she gave. People experience profound levels of grief because their loved ones have died due to gun violence. Okay. People experience profound levels of grief because their loved ones have died due to gun violence. Okay? So take it home and look at it. Yeah? And then, if it's not correct, see if you can rewrite it in some way that conveys a meaning that could be in a valid syllogism.